Greetings and salutations, friends. My name is, of course, Charles Q. Banks, and I'd like to welcome you to my discussion video in black and white about Hellboy 2019, because I just watched Hellboy 2019, and guess what? I liked it. This fact puts me at odds with basically all of the popular, professional, official critiques of movies on all of the internet, apparently. So many of them giving this film a horrible grade, horrible reviews, 16% Rotten Tomatoes scores. That means that they believe that 84% of this movie was unpassable, was absolutely horrible, and that the rest of it was 16% okay. That's what that means. And there is a disparity between the professional critics and the audience scores, which, you know, pretty big disparity, but still people don't think that this film is very good, with audience members giving it 60% about, or around there. Between 6 and 7, generally on most websites. The audience enjoys this more than the critiques and the critics, but less. It's generally thought of as less than great, less than especially the original Hellboy movies. And I've got to say, I am definitely a huge fan of the original Hellboy movies. I think they were absolutely brilliant pieces of visual masterworks and craftsmanship, but they weren't the best movies. Cinematically speaking, there was a lot that those movies had left to be desired. And that's okay. Like, I'm not particularly guilty about liking The Golden Army or the first Hellboy movie, because they did so much right in so many ways, particularly action and visuals. The storyline did kind of suffer. It was just basic, you know, destroy the world villain with, you know, stick together as a team and fight the enemy plot, and didn't have that great acting. Ron Perlman and John Hurt were amazing in those movies, but John Hurt was only in the first one, and Ron Perlman was not given a whole lot of room to act with any variety or range in those movies. Hellboy was basically just a big tank who was, you know, just a boss in his own right, didn't care what anyone thought or said, and the worst thing that he had going against him was the fact that he was addicted to beer, okay? So there wasn't a whole lot of characterization, right, in those movies. But again, great movies. I think that they really paid homage and did due honor to the original comic book, because the comic book is where the buck stops, okay? The comic book is really the only place where you will ever find a fully fleshed out character of Hellboy. There are enough issues, enough pages of Hellboy coming against different villains, being in different situations, that he just has to react to in different ways to actually flesh out his character. I don't think Hellboy can be fully realized in just one movie. That's definitely true for the original Hellboy movie, and it's also true for this one. However, I will say that the Hellboy in this movie did a better job of giving the character backstory and development than the original Hellboy movie, and I will get into the reasons why I think that. But I actually want to discuss not only why I thought this film was good, but also why people think this film was bad. So I've written down all of the different major critiques that the critiques have against this movie, and I wanted to deal with them one by one. So let's just get into it, alright? First of all, people have said that this movie has poor humor, very bad humor, that there were a lot of jokes and that all of them fell flat. that they really leaned into the comedy in this movie, but that all of them fell flat and were just unfunny and really bogged down the movie. Now, when I saw the trailers, that's kind of what I felt. I expected that to be the truth, because all of the jokes that they showed in the trailer were really bad, just situational humor that didn't have really a punchline. It wasn't funny, and it was being touted as like a comedic R-rated film. And, you know, so anyway, that's what they're saying, is that the way it seemed to be in the trailers is the way that the whole movie was, in terms of poor quality humor and jokes. And what I have to say to that, based on seeing the whole movie, is that I don't even think that that's true. I don't think that this movie was even trying to be a comedy. I don't think there was a whole lot to be found comedic about this movie. There weren't that many jokes, and the ones that were jokes were actually so understated that I don't know that anyone would ever actually laugh out loud at them, even if the jokes were stated better or something. I really don't think they were going for a comedy flair with this movie. They went all in comedy in The Golden Army, actually. It was basically a family-friendly, kind of Disney-feeling movie that was, you know, Del Toro's designs, which are crazy and creepy and cool, but everything else about the movie was a very, like, teen fiction, comedy-centric film. Almost like The Muppets or something. And that really actually brought that film down. This film, however, like I said, all of the quote-unquote jokes that they reference as being bad jokes were not even treated very well, treated very much as jokes in this movie. And so I don't even think you're meant to laugh at a lot of it. I did get a few chuckles out of, you know, some of the things that were said, but you don't have to go all in lambasting a movie for having some throwaway lines that add character. You know, a joke doesn't have to be funny in order for it to add character and lend context for the movie. I remember hearing one of these critiques that thought the movie was bad, or at least very poor, saying that, you know, an unknown vehicle drives up to Hellboy after he's been in a fight, and Hellboy says, "Is that my Uber?" And, you know, that's just part of Hellboy's character, right? He just says these sorts of things. He makes reference to, you know, unless we're playing Yahtzee, I don't want to mess with you, demon. Type thing. I don't want to play games with you, you know? And it's like, that's not really a joke. That's just a witticism that, you know, you say to kind of lift the spirits. And Hellboy actually states at one point that he tends to make jokes in order to lift the tension, and that's what his psychologist told him, which is kind of funny in its own right. So that's part of his character. That's part of who he is. His jokes may not be funny, but that's what he does anyway. So I don't think that it is a fair criticism to say that this movie tried real hard to be comedic and failed. That is a very unfair criticism. I did think that some of the characters might have ended up being annoying if they went that direction with the comedy, but they didn't. There's the Alice character, young black character, that could have been very annoying. Could have been really brusque and feminist and, you know, like, I'm better than everyone else. But she wasn't annoying at all. She was actually, you know, a strong female, you know, a strong female, that's all, who's British and actually pretty likable. She talked to a lot of the other characters in a pretty human, normal way, and didn't go all in with the jokes. I mean, there were a couple of jokes that she did make that were like, yeah, I can see someone actually liking that joke. I didn't find it funny, but does that mean that the movie deserves to have points taken off? I don't think so. Humor is so subjective. Unless the movie is itself a comedy in genre, you can't really come against it to say the movie is bad for that reason. If you find that really annoying, that might take points off, but I didn't find any of the humor to be annoying or poorly done. or I didn't even find there to be much like R-rated bad humor in it. Of course, there were cuss words, but it's an R-rated movie. They're going to throw those in there. The F-bomb is dropped many times, and if they were going for a family-friendly feel, kind of like the original Hellboy, which is, again, kind of paradoxical, then, yeah, I'd say, you know, they shouldn't cuss. But they went all in with the R rating, and so they had the freedom to do that. The second critique that I want to discuss is the fact that people think that there were too many conflicting plot lines. This is the main critique, I think, for the whole film, and what most people say when they say that the film was poorly done, why it deserves a bad rating, or why it deserves to be seen as mediocre. That the movie had way too many plot lines going on at the same time, and the movie moved too fast and didn't address all of the plot lines well enough. I totally disagree with that. I've also heard people saying that this movie, because of that, this movie doesn't know what it's doing. That this movie couldn't decide what tone it wanted, couldn't decide which direction to take, and it's because of that conflicting plot lines idea. And I think this movie knew exactly what it wanted to be, and that is just pouring as much content from the original comic books as possible, as many plot lines as possible, into this movie, and come out on the other end with an understandable, you know, cause and effect style movie that made sense in the end. It's a pretty simple story, actually. Bad guys want to kill Hellboy. Bad guys raise a witch to try and do that. Bad guys fight amongst themselves and fight Hellboy. And, you know, of course, we know if you watch this movie, you're not expecting there to be some kind of upset. Hellboy wins in the end. And of course, it's the journey to get there that matters the most. That's a pretty simple plotline, guys. Like, I don't see what the trouble is. There is a very fast editing philosophy in this movie. It's a very fast-paced movie, but that is exactly why I prefer this movie in terms of pacing to the original Hellboy movies. The original Hellboy movies took a lot of time away from the plot to have random jokes, random conversations that didn't actually lend any depth to the characters, but just kind of gave you some character interaction, right? And that character interaction was good, but it didn't have much to drive the story on. They say in writing classes, does the scene drive the story along? If not, cut it. And I think this new movie actually did that. It cut the crap, and it stayed the course with its plotline and sped up the plot to a very exciting pace, I think. And there was never a time that I got bored. There was never a time where I thought, I don't know what's going on. And there was never a time where I thought, wait, which plotline are we working on now? Which means that people have been accusing this movie of something that doesn't even happen, which is having conflicting plot lines. There is one plot line. There are many scenes, many characters, many backstories, but there is one plot line. So I think it's just an issue of mischaracterization and misuse of words. Maybe you didn't like how fast the movie was. If that's true, then that is a perfectly workable argument. But you have to bring your argument legitimacy by giving examples. And most people generally didn't. They usually say that there were this many villains, and there were tons of them, and they all had different motivations, and it wasn't confusing, but there were so many of them that it was too much. And like I said, it comes down to that one plot line. So yeah, not legitimate argument against this movie. But I think the main reason why people say that about this movie is because they say there are too many flashbacks. And that's the third critique that I want to talk about. There are a lot of flashbacks in this movie, and I want to immediately say that a lot of movies and a lot of stories, especially in teen fiction, even in stories that I've tried writing back when I was a teen, definitely had a lot of flashbacks because as a writer, I didn't, and I think the same is true for many teen fiction writers, when you're that young, you don't really know how to create a character that is both exciting and has an exciting backstory without using flashbacks. And flashbacks are not new in terms of cinema, but there have been many movies that abused the flashback trope and did it poorly. That doesn't mean that the flashback trope is a bad thing inherently, but too many flashbacks can definitely bring a movie down and change the pacing to something that isn't happening in real life. Because if people are watching a movie and are watching things happening in present time, and then it flashes back, and then it comes back to the present, and then it flashes back again to someone else, and it flashes back again and again, you're gonna start to feel bored because you feel like there is no present progression of a plot. You're just getting backstory. And that definitely does happen many times in this movie, but the flashbacks happen so quickly that I felt it didn't bring the story down. And a lot of those are actually pretty darn important to the story, giving reasons for this character to know that one, giving reasons for the main characters to go to a certain place. It all makes sense. And I think those flashbacks were actually used well. I would say it drives along the story because, again, a lot of the characters' backstories have a lot to do with the things that happen in the climax. So yeah, like you might be able to say there are too many. But my argument is that all of them were used well. The Bourne Identity, for instance, had tons of flashbacks, and it's related to the plot of a person who has amnesia. Amnesia is a constant trope, right? But that didn't mean that it was done badly in The Bourne Identity, or any of the subsequent Bourne movies. And I think they were legitimate flashbacks in this title. But if you didn't enjoy those, I can understand it. That is actually a legitimate critique. The next critique that we're going on to talk about is number 4, the R rating and the violence. When people saw that this movie was going to be R-rated, I saw many people cheering in the audience that Hellboy would be R-rated, because the original Hellboy comics, and even the animations, and also the original Hellboy movies by Guillermo del Toro, had a very adult, mature sensibility to them. The movies, however, obviously went the family-friendly route, and a lot of people were kind of mad about that because there is so much violence, there is so much darkness, Satanism, the occult. These are themes that all happen in Hellboy, and you cannot have those in a Disney-esque family-friendly movie. And to have Hellboy finally come up into the cinematic world as an R rating, as having an R rating, could only be good, right? Well, the critiques don't think so. The critiques think that the R rating was just there to cause hype, I guess, and to get people excited for gore and violence. And that the gore and violence that does occur is absolutely useless, is not interesting, doesn't have anything to do with the plot, and is thrown in there just to pad out the movie and to justify an R rating. I've seen movies that try to do that, and this is not one of them. There's definitely gore and violence throughout, and there are certain pieces of the story that are just like, holy crap, that was gross, right? But it's definitely all contained in the world of Hellboy. For instance, and this is a slight spoiler for a moment in the movie, so if you don't want to hear it, skip ahead probably 30 seconds. the boar character takes the throat of a person who doesn't want to say magic words. He eats it and speaks in that person's voice because he got the throat in his mouth, in his throat, and spoke with his windpipes. That is extremely grotesque and weird, but he used it to great effect because he's a magical boar creature. Okay, so that's the kind of grotesquerie we're dealing with, and that's the kind of R rating that we have here. I think the R rating was very well deserved because this stuff is very intense, and I don't see this type of thing happening in a non-R-rated movie. Okay? The same with the ending. When people bring up this R rating and how it was unjustified, they bring up the demon scene at the end, which was basically fully shown in the Red Line trailer, which was saying, this is an R-rated movie, look how R-rated it is. And it shows the entire demon scene that happens at the climax of the movie. And the demons are just ripping people apart, skinning them alive, smashing them against their swords, smashing them against the ground, impaling them, etc. And it's very grotesque, but it's like, the point is to show how evil these demons are. These are actual demons. This is a hellscape that is being created above ground, and this is what would happen if these giant demonic powers started to take over the earth. And it's very effective, it's very shocking, and it's for the shock factor that they put these things in there. Like, that was the point. Like, why would you make a movie R-rated unless you wanted to have something that would be R-rated in it? You know what I mean? Like, why would you attack the R rating for having inappropriate blood and gore in it when it is stated that this movie would have blood and gore in it? It doesn't make any sense. Unless you just don't like blood and gore, in which case I would say, don't go to an R-rated movie. Okay? I would rather there not be blood and gore like this, because it's very grotesque, and it's not pleasant, but it serves its purpose. And I, for one, have definitely been desensitized. I think everyone in the cinematic and gaming community has been desensitized very well to violence and gore, and we don't need necessarily to, in our R-rated movies, censor these things as in other rating systems and genres. So, yeah, I would say that the original Hellboy, its mature themes did shine through without all of that blood and gore, and I praise it for that, actually. And I'd rather there not be all this crazy stuff. But the crazy stuff in Hellboy is so crazy and so over the top that I think it has value in cinema. That, you know, many people have likened this movie and that demon scene to Blood Sea, which is a very R-rated anime about a vampire girl and how she fights demons, and these demons ripping people apart and stuff, and it's very shocking, it's very traumatizing, and that's the point, is to have this feeling of despair going on. And when the good guy comes and fights against the evil, that sense of despair is lifted and changed, right? The amount of darkness there is in a story is definitely indicative of how intense of a contrast they want to show between good and evil. And I think this movie does a very good job of contrasting the moral ambiguity of Hellboy's character with the absolute evil that exists in the underworld. So, our rating, I guess, gets a thumbs up for me. At least they went all in. They did what they said they would do. And these demons definitely, I think, are much more frightening for the fact that they are so shockingly violent than if the same weren't true and they didn't really kill anyone in a grotesque way. They would just be, oh, that's an interesting monster. So moving on to the next critique. Number 5, thin characters, or one-dimensional characters. Now, the problem with this critique is that there's not a whole lot to compare this to when it comes to other Hellboy instances, other than, of course, the comic book. The comic book contains a lot of really interesting characters with interesting backstories, but it doesn't do a whole lot for development. They are very interesting, caricatures, but there's not too much to say more than what is on the surface. The original Hellboy movies also had thin characters, one-dimensional characters, that they were extreme in that characteristic that they had, but that was basically all there was to them. This girl is a, really prophetic pyromancer who can't really control her abilities. Her emotions cause her to fly off the handle. Hellboy is, a devil-may-care type guy, pun intended, who works for the BPRD, but is, morally ambiguous and definitely sort of an angry person on the inside. That's all there is to him. Then there's the protagonist of the original Hellboy movie, and he's a flat, blank slate character that you are supposed to relate to as the audience. So I have to say, what were you expecting from a Hellboy movie when all of the other Hellboy movies had one-note characters originally? In The Golden Army, the second Hellboy movie by Del Toro, there's even less character in the movie, less development. It's just a basic adventure in the mind of Del Toro, which is very interesting and cool looking, very visually captivating, a total masterpiece of visuals, but not a whole lot of characterization, I'm sorry to say. So, as a fan of Hellboy, I would have wanted a little bit more characterization, and we didn't get it for the side characters. But we did get it for the main character of Hellboy, and this is where the 6th critique comes in. People disliked David Harbour as Hellboy, and the depiction of Hellboy with his new look. Now, the look I can understand. I did not like the look of Hellboy, actually. Throughout the entire film, I was looking at his face and being like, ugh, why did they do that? Like, he has all of these horizontal scars, and scars around his lips, scars around his eyes. His forehead is basically completely dominated by his horns, and it looks absolutely grotesque. However, that is a theme to the character of Hellboy, that he feels a sense of self-hatred and self-deprecation throughout his entire life. He feels guilty for being a demonic entity, for being a devil boy, right? That is his character. That is a big part of his character. And I think the beginning scene of the movie, after the first introduction of the villain, really set the tone for the rest of the movie. And that scene is Hellboy going to investigate one of his brothers-in-arms at the BPRD, who has not reported in lately. And spoilers again, skip probably 30 seconds ahead again. This character turns into a vampire that Hellboy has to fight, and he ends up accidentally killing him in that fight. And he is absolutely wrecked by this emotionally. And it really sets up the fact that Hellboy is really conflicted inside about being someone who kills monsters while being himself a monster. That is the central plot. That is not the plot, but the central storyline to Hellboy, the central development, the central theme, the core of the movie is Hellboy having problems with killing monsters and not being a true human being. And he learns more about himself throughout the movie. He is very hesitant and reticent to kill monsters after that beginning scene. He's not someone who's just like, okay, let's fight everything. I love fighting. I love killing, like Ron Perlman was. Which, is cool, but it doesn't mean that Ron Perlman's Hellboy was relatable. David Harbour's Hellboy is relatable. And you can feel that through every scene that he's in. He has a massive range of emotion that can be very easily felt. And he's able to move his face through the makeup pretty darn well. The horns kind of do, like I said, dominate his face. But it really does inform his character the way he acts. So I have to say kudos, good job to David Harbour. Best thing about this movie. Not thin, very well developed. And I think this character is also very relatable to the audience because throughout the whole story, it is characterizing him as a conflicted character, but at the end it really gets down to kind of this metaphor of the duality of man being, at his core, depraved, which I kind of really do identify with. I do believe that most people have at their core evil. Like, men have a tendency towards evil. They have potential for good, but if left to their own devices, if not taught, men will do the most selfish, depraved things imaginable. And so that's what Hellboy sees in humanity, and that's what the monsters see in humanity, that humanity is corrupt. They waffle back and forth between good and evil all the time, hypocritically, and they're trying to tempt Hellboy to their side, to destroy humanity and become the king of monsters, basically. Let's just call it that. Bring about the doom of the world and become the king of the underworld. The underworld would rise to the top, and there would be a basic hellscape of all monsters living in the way that they want to live, which is pretty horrible, of course, to a human standard. So when you look at the way that Hellboy struggles with this, and he comes out on the other end victorious, you can see that he really does struggle with that identity, but that he fights for the good. And his father, who's played by Ian McShane, Professor Broom, is always, even though he bred him to be a weapon, was always wanting to make him a good person, was trying to lead him down a righteous path. And it's really touching, and it really well depicts that nuanced duality of man theme, and it's really good. It really hit me right there. And so, just for that reason alone, I would recommend this movie to anyone willing to see an R-rated film. If that doesn't resonate with you, I can see that also being a big problem. But that's what I really have to say about this movie, that theme and the character of Hellboy he's very human, despite the emphasis on his monsterhood. And it really works for this film, and it really works for the comics. Like, there is so much from the comics that was put into this movie, and I think this, it bears being said, but the comic is really well done. But this is what I have to say about the whole Hellboy thing, is that Hellboy really does exemplify a niche character, a niche genre. He is a subgenre character of comic book heroes. He is not the most commonplace, popular type of hero. He's barely even an anti-hero. Like, he changes a lot in the comic books, from just a hero and a detective to an anti-hero to the bad guy in a couple of issues. And then he realizes what happened, and then he comes back to himself as a hero again, then an anti-hero, back to a detective, and just an action hero. So, as that is the case, I don't think Hellboy will ever appeal to a widespread audience in the future. No more than it already has. The original Hellboy was very, very popular for what it was. It didn't make as much as most other comic book or superhero movies at the time, but it was popular. Popular enough to warrant a second movie, but the second movie wasn't popular enough to warrant a third. And now we have this new reboot, which I think a lot of films fans of the original films didn't want, because they wanted Ron Perlman back. And I did too. When I saw the trailers, I was like, oh crap. A very Hellboy thing to say. A lot of fans were like, where is Ron Perlman? Why are you redoing this story? And I was afraid they would redo the same exact story the same exact way. And they didn't. They still did, I think, the main story of the Fist of Doom, which is very important to the character, but they added so much more from the comics into that, like the Arthurian legends, the Wild Hunt, these things that have never been seen before, including Lobster. And this is probably the last thing, probably number 7. People actually complained about the presence of Lobster Johnson in the movie. There's a flashback to Lobster Johnson fighting Nazis, and it's basically just to say how they found Hellboy, right? And if you know the story, you know the comics, you know that the evil warlock Rasputin opened a Hellgate and brought Hellboy into our world. And it's at that moment that Lobster Johnson comes in, a hero who's working for the American government during World War II, fights off the Nazis, and closes the Hellgate with the help of Professor Broom and his American soldiers. And so I've heard people say, like, why are you going to throw in this super character if he's only going to be there for a few minutes? Like, it seemed stupid. It was very cheesy, and I love superheroes. I love cheesy superheroes, but it really didn't fit the tone of the film. But if you don't like that, then you don't like the comic books. All right, you don't need to put forth that the comic books were good if you think that everything in this film was bad, because this film really appeals to everything that I liked about the original comics. And in the original comics, there is like a 1-panel page, maybe 2-panel page, of the American soldiers with a superhero fighting alongside Dr. Broom. It wasn't Lobster Johnson. It was just some other superhero who never showed up again, who fought alongside them. And you saw that, and it's like, oh, hey, that's cool. There are superheroes in this world? Okay. And you never saw him again. So for Lobster Johnson to take that place in this movie instead of that other superhero, I think is actually more interesting, because more of the fans of the original comic will be able to recognize Lobster Johnson over that random superhero. Maybe it wasn't like as true to the comic as it could have been, but it paid even more fan service to us, the fans, than, just leaving Lobster out of it, right? So, yeah, like, the whole concept of Hellboy is very cheesy and weird and dark and horrific. And there is an interplay between all of those things. Like, it's black comedy in a lot of ways. And there's black comedy in this movie, too. It's not always that comedic, but it has that kind of uncomfortable feeling where it's like, oh, he put his head in there. Oh. It's that sort of feeling. And that's what the movie and the comic books went for, and I think they nailed it. How good do I think this movie is? Well, I thought that the original Hellboy movies were like an 8 out of 10, because I could identify with them, I could watch them as a child and not be completely traumatized. Morally, I think those movies are still good, and really the masterpieces of aesthetics. This movie, I won't say that it's as good in terms of aesthetics. I prefer the practical beast and character creations in that movie over this one. Even though they did do some prosthetics, I'm sure, with Baba Yaga especially, but the CGI in it was not bad. It was actually pretty fun what they did with the CGI. Interesting and cool. Characters were really neat to look at and grotesque, which is always the point in Hellboy. But that's the only thing that the old ones had over this one. The only two things, I should say. That It's more widely accessible. The old ones were more widely accessible and had better visuals. With this movie, the thing this movie has over those movies is the pacing and the action scenes. The pacing of this movie is so nice compared to the original. I thought that the original had some boring moments, some boring character interactions, like I said, but this movie truly went above and beyond in keeping it interesting and keeping it sped up, fast, and by the end you're like, oh, that's it? Dang it, I wanted more. So I would say this movie is maybe a 7, probably a 7, maybe an 8, because it's above average for me, and it did all the things I wanted it to do from a Hellboy movie, and I'm a big fan of Hellboy. So let me know what you thought of Hellboy in the comments. That's really all I have to say left. I'd like to thank you for watching my videos. If you do, yeah. So thanks for watching, and until next time, farewell.